So we sing songs like that, what a day that will be, and we look forward to how awesome it's going to be and what the future is going to behold, but we're not living there yet. So what do we do with that reality? What do we do with the concept of we say something is going to be better in the future, but we're still living with difficulties now. We're still living with struggles now. We're still living with heartache now. How do we deal with that? Well, there are times where we see somebody else struggling, and we can have different responses to that. One of the responses is that of sympathy. We can see someone struggling, someone going through a difficult time, and we can feel sorry for them. And while sympathy doesn't necessarily have any demeaning connotations, sometimes it can. Like we have pity and we say, oh, how poor them. And it's almost like, woe is them, and we feel better than them. Now, if we go a step further, another response is that of empathy. Of not just seeing someone, feeling sorry for them, but actually feeling for them, hurting with them. When someone's going through a difficult time, it's sitting there and crying with them or hurting with them, whatever that context looks like. And so as we think about the difficulties we face now, one of the things I'm comforted is by the fact is that God hurts when we hurt. When we are struggling, God is not indifferent. He's not just looking down on us in a way that's condemning. He's coming to us in a way that's saying, I'm with you. I'm feeling your pain. I'm hurting when you hurt. And this is especially important when we consider what Habakkuk is dealing with as he is dealing with God's message. Because in chapter 1, verse 2 and 4, Habakkuk shares a complaint. He sees that there's injustice happening within God's people. We have King Jehoiakim, who is leading God's people, and he is corrupt. He is evil. He is against God. And Habakkuk says, why are you allowing this to happen? Why are you allowing these evil leaders to be in place and make terrible decisions that are oppressive, that are harmful, that are hurting your people and leading your people away from you? And God's response to Habakkuk is that he was going to raise up the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians were a cruel, terrifying people. They played by their own rules. They didn't submit to anybody. They were fierce. In a lot of ways, they took no prisoners. Now, that's not literal, but the point of the matter is that they were very brutal to those who would try to stand against them. And so they treated those people that would stand against them in horrific ways. And so Habakkuk hears God's response. Habakkuk's first complaint is, why is there injustice within your people? And then God says, well, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians to bring judgment upon my people. So we come to the end of chapter 1, and Habakkuk shares his second complaint. That's what my version says. It's titled as Habakkuk's second complaint. And he's talking to the Lord and says, O Lord, a holy and eternal one, surely you do not plan to wipe us out. O Lord, our rock, you have sent the Babylonians to correct and punish us for our many sins. But you are pure, and you cannot stand the sight of evil. Will you wink at their treachery? Will you be silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Are we only fish to be caught and killed? Are we only creatures of the sea with no leader? Must we be strung on their hooks and caught in their nets while they celebrate and rejoice? Then they will worship their nets, claiming these nets are our gods, which have made us rich. So that's Habakkuk's question. He sees God's response, that God is going to bring judgment against his people by means of the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, hold on. Why are you allowing that to happen? Habakkuk has lamented the injustice that he's experiencing within God's people. God is going to raise up a heathen people to bring judgment on God's people. And Habakkuk is questioning that. Wait, am I hearing you correctly? Is this what you're actually going to allow? It was confusing for Habakkuk that God would use the Babylonians as his instrument for judgment. Because the Babylonians were very corrupt, were very evil, were very against God, much more so than God's people were. Essentially, we see that God is going to replace one corrupt regime, that is Jehoiakim, with another corrupt regime that is even worse, that is the Babylonians. And Habakkuk is struggling to say, why is this happening? But in the midst of this, he affirms several things about God, that God is holy, that God is eternal. And now we can affirm those things about God in a way that really doesn't mean much to us. Well, we can say God is eternal, but does that have any impact on our lives? But he also affirms that God is our rock, that he is our foundation, that he is essential to who we are. Even though Habakkuk was struggling to grasp this reality, he recognized that God was foundational for who he was, that God was his rock. But God's holiness is also an important piece here. Habakkuk also says that God is pure, that he cannot stand the sight of evil. Now, sometimes we talk about God's justice, and that when evil happens or sin happens, God is just, and he has to deal with that somehow. He can't just ignore it. If God ignored it, he would not be just. When we allow bad things to happen, ignoring it is not healthy, and God does not ignore evil. But we see with the Babylonians, it seems to be implied that God is using evil to deal with evil. How does that work? Especially if God is a holy God who cannot stand the sight of evil, how can he do that? How is that not a contradiction? Now, we may come back to a point that's even more fundamental than this, is why does a holy God allow this much evil to begin with? We affirm several things about God. We affirm that he is all-powerful. We affirm that he is loving. We affirm that he is holy. If he's all-powerful and he is loving, why would he allow us to go through this suffering? Why would he allow his people to achieve such corruption? And then why would he allow his people to be subject to the terror of the Babylonians? I mean, those are real questions. Now, and sometimes it can be real easy to read Habakkuk's story and read his distress and be removed from it, because that's not our context. What Habakkuk is going through is sometimes hard to apply to our own lives, but we face injustice. We face difficulties. We face hardships. We face questions that are really difficult at best to answer. But if we're honest with ourselves, we've had questions before. We say, well, I'm a better Christian than that person. Why are they more successful than I am? I'm following Jesus and that person doesn't want anything to do with Jesus. Why are they allowed to thrive? Why doesn't Jesus care about me? And in some ways, those questions have given rise to the prosperity gospel. Jeremiah 29:11, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you. We go to that and we say, Romans 8:28, God works for the good of those who love him. We like those verses. We want God to help us. But if we limit God to our lucky rabbit's foot that increases our odds of success, then we're missing what God wants to do for us. See, that's not what God's purpose is. His purpose is not just to make your temporary life a little bit better. Through Jesus Christ, he came to solve eternal problems, not just temporary ones. So how do we deal with this? Because it's easy to say, well, why is this suffering happening to me? Why are these difficulties happening in my life? But one of the things I'm reminded of as I was going through this, as I was looking at these concepts and Habakkuk's message, it can be real easy to succumb to the temptation to try to rush through it. To say, suck it up and move on. Or I just have to find a way to persevere. And while we don't know how long this discourse of Habakkuk is, it's only 3 chapters. It's a short book. But if we rush through these questions, through these difficulties, what's going to happen is that our foundation is going to be real thin at best. Because we all face hard times. We all face difficulties. We all have situations that we either are or have or will face that are hard to reconcile with the power and the love of God. If God is all-powerful and God is loving, why would he allow this in my life? Why did he not give me that promotion? Why did he not give me wisdom to make that decision? Why didn't he heal me in this way? Why did he allow this? We all have those problems. If we rush through them, I think we miss some of the grace that God wants to pour out upon us. We miss the foundation that can help us persevere when we face difficult situations. Because as I've said before, if we don't allow these questions to be asked in the church, they're going to be asked somewhere else. They're going to be asked on Google. They're going to be asked at another establishment that doesn't care anything about Jesus. It may be a fine establishment, but it's not going to have a foundation in Jesus. And that's why we have to rest here a while. That's why we can't rush this. I want to make sure that as we think about these difficult questions, we don't just try to have a feel-good moment and move on. Because when things aren't hard, we can have cliche answers and feel pretty good about ourselves. Well, we just trust God. Well, we know God has a plan. It's awfully hard to say that when we're going through difficult circumstances. Let's not rush that. Because Habakkuk doesn't. He has one complaint, God answers, and we're in the second complaint. He is seeking God. He is going to him. And then he uses some imagery in this conversation. He asks God, are we not just like fish in the sea to be caught and killed? Now, some of you are fishermen or fisherwomen. Some of you like to fish. And you know, there are times where the fish aren't biting. Habakkuk is not necessarily talking about somebody who's just casting for bass or trying to get catfish off the floor. He's talking about the fishermen that got these huge nets that bring in these huge haul of fish that you go to sell at market. And while I understand there are times where the fish aren't biting and it's not one of those things where everybody can fish and have a lucrative career with it, but there are places where the fish gather in such large schools that nets can haul up huge amounts of fish at one time. And Habakkuk equates God's people as those schools of fish that get caught up in a single net. So, you know, as people, we gather together. We are made for community, and fish live in schools. And so as a school of fish can be caught up together as one, Habakkuk is scared that God's people are going to be caught up together as one just to be killed. And he struggles with that. He questions it. Why is that happening? Now, one of the things we have to come back to is to recognize that God created the fish in the sea. He created the Babylonians. He created the Israelites, the Jews, and the people of Judah. He created Habakkuk. He created everything, and so he can use everything for his purposes. So we may have this problem of evil. Why does God allow this evil to happen over here, but not this evil over here? It's all God's creation. Now God is not the creator of evil, but he gives us the ability to sin and do evil things. But we are part of God's creation. And so God can use creation for his purposes. So we can think of the Babylonians. He could just go to back and say, well, I created you, I created them, I can do whatever I want. Now, that's not exactly how God responds, but we do see how there is some power in who God is and that he can use creation however his purposes are needed. But the fish in the sea live by different rules than the land animals. Now, we have crossover when you think of certain mammals that, like whales and dolphins, that have to breathe air but live exclusively in the water. And you can think of amphibians or some reptiles that spend some time in the water, some time on land. But there are different rules to those who live in the sea. And so part of what Habakkuk is getting at is that Babylon lives by different rules. So these people that live by different rules are going to come and swallow up God's people who are trying to be faithful, who are trying to serve him, even though they're corrupt, even though they're not perfect, even though they've messed up. And Habakkuk is saying, why are you allowing these Babylonians to come? Because Habakkuk knows God's holiness. But he recognizes that there's an absence of God's holiness in the world. He sees this disconnect and he's lamenting about it. God's plan, as Habakkuk understands it, is allowing evil to thrive, allowing the Babylonians to thrive with no consequences. So it would be us saying that co-worker of ours who has nothing to do with Jesus, who is living an immoral life and making shady decisions, is getting ahead, and God doesn't care. And I try to follow God with integrity. Or we have this person over here who received a healing, but man, I prayed more than they did. Why would God not answer my prayer? And we have these problems in real life of why is God not answering? Why is God not dealing with sin and evil in the way that we think he should? God's raising up the Babylonians, an enemy nation, to punish his people. Now, we have to be careful when we're talking about the Old Testament and the Promised Land and Israel and all of that. We see that the Promised Land functioned as a spiritual barometer for God's people. That when they were faithfully serving Jesus, the land was at peace. It was plentiful. When they rejected Jesus, they didn't have Jesus in the Old Testament, sorry. When they were faithfully serving God. But when they rejected God, then what would happen is they would be rejecting God's presence, so his protection would be removed. They'd have war, they'd have famine, they'd have disease. Now, that's not exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about our time, because we're not talking about the prosperity gospel. Israel had a covenant with God about the promised land. It was their inheritance. But through Jesus, we have a greater inheritance that we're looking forward to that is not just tied to these temporary issues in our world. But the temporary issues in the world are still meaningful. Your job is meaningful. Your home is meaningful. Your health is meaningful. Those things are meaningful. But Jesus is calling us to something greater, but we still have the question of how do we deal with it now? How do we process it now of why God answers some and doesn't answer others? Because the Babylonians represent a corrupt people. I think we can say that the government has been corrupt throughout history. Now, there are good people in government. There are people who I believe are faithfully trying to do the best they can. But the government in general is corrupt. Particularly the higher up you get, the more corruption you can see and the more possibility there is for corruption. Babylonians were corrupt. God's people were corrupt at the same time. But the Babylonian corruption, their sin, their evil was worse. Their policies of military conquest, of oppression, of exploitation, and economic gain hurt others. Now, one of the things I think that Habakkuk calls us to do, he calls us to question the imperialistic policies of our own nation. You know, our government tells us what it does is good. And I'm not trying to rag on the government. I'm not trying to say we need to be anarchists by any means. But to recognize just because the government says it's good, just because somebody says it's good, doesn't mean that we put our hope in the government. Our hope is not in our nation. Our hope is in Jesus. And we can't assume our country is doing good. Our country may be doing things that are good, but there's a big difference between things that are good and things that are God. We have to make sure we don't confuse the two. But Habakkuk is getting ready to do something that is foundational for his process. And I think foundational for our process. The older I get, I think the more wisdom I understand. And when I say understand, because just because you understand wisdom doesn't mean you live wisdom. You can know things, but that doesn't mean you actually allow that to impact how you live. And one of the words of wisdom that I really enjoy is the fact that the words silent and listen have the same letters. They're anagrams. That in order for you to listen, you have to be silent. You can't listen and talk at the same time. We're in a society that loves to multitask, and it's not effective. You can't listen and do something else at the same time. You have to stop, you have to be silent, and you have to give your focus to that, which is what Habakkuk is committing to doing. Now, he has a question before he does that. The end of chapter 1, verse 17, he's talking to God. He says, will you let them get away with this forever? Will they succeed forever in their heartless conquest? And then he gets to chapter 2, and this is foundational for the book. He says, I will climb to my watchtower and stand at my guard post. There I will wait to see what the Lord says and how he will answer my complaint. So he asks another question in this. There's nothing wrong with Habakkuk questioning. There's nothing wrong with Habakkuk struggling with this reality. There's nothing wrong with us questioning why. Asking how come it is happening this way. Why God isn't answering this way. There's nothing wrong with having questions. But Habakkuk is not having a question that is causing him doubt. He is struggling and wrestling with his faith. Remember, the name Habakkuk means to wrestle with or to embrace. He is wrestling with these difficult questions of why God is allowing this. How long will God allow the Babylonians to continue to go without being hindered? How long will their evil continue to thrive? And Habakkuk struggling, and rightfully so. When difficult things happen to us, we struggle with the reality of why. Why is this happening? Why didn't God step in and do something different? Why did God allow it to get to this point? He's asking God, how long will this happen? And part of his struggle is Habakkuk he knows who God is, but he sees what God is allowing, and he's having difficulty reconciling who God is with what God is allowing. He's confused. He's troubled. He's in angst. But he makes a commitment. He waits. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1 is essential. Now he says, I'm going to climb to my watchtower and stand at my guard post. He didn't go cower. He didn't go hide. He didn't go get in the fetal position. He went to a strong point and say, God, I'm going to wait for you, not in a way that was defiant, not in a way that was aggressive, but in a way that was assertive. He was not passive in his attempt to figure out what God was doing. He went to God and said, I am going to wait. And he's confident that God will answer. Now, when we say confident that God will answer, God doesn't always answer the way we want. If we have confidence in God, it's not as though we're going to manipulate God to give us the answer that we think we should have. See, Habakkuk believes that God has a greater purpose, that Habakkuk may not fully understand all of what God is doing. He recognizes that, so he says, I'm going to wait so I can get understanding. I'm going to seek God and wait so that I might have greater wisdom. I think sometimes we forget that faith precedes understanding. We want understanding to precede faith. We want to have all the information, all the knowledge, all the wisdom, and then we'll believe. But you know, one of the problems with that, you could get to the conclusion that you have to have a certain IQ level in order to get to God. We just have to believe. And when we believe, we can seek him and God will give us wisdom. Now, God doesn't answer everybody in the same way, but Habakkuk is going to God recognizing there's got to be something greater here, something I don't fully understand, so I'm going to go to God. I'm going to wait for his answer, wait for his presence to come to me. But this is really hard in our world today. It's probably always been hard, but in our world today, we live in a world of instant gratification. We want it now. We want it immediately. If we have to wait in the drive-thru for an extra minute and a half, we go crazy, right? We want it now. Habakkuk waited. He was facing difficult circumstances. He was living in a different reality, so he waited. We look around our world and we see that evil seems to thrive. And we question as to why. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or why do good things happen to bad people? So I stand here today recognizing I don't have all the answers. I could come up here and say, well, I could give a paragraph as to how we can deal with this and move on. But the issue is not that we philosophically grasp this reality. It's how do we live? How do we function? Because if we just try to move on, we're missing the point of waiting. We're trying to rush this. And we can't rush these difficult questions or we're not going to have the proper foundation. Habakkuk was trying to reconcile the message he received from God and who he knows God to be. We know God to be holy, good, all-powerful, all-knowing, loving. We know God to be those things, but yet we see these things over here, and it's hard to reconcile. It's hard to grasp. Again, the questions Habakkuk has are not a question of doubting God, of deep faith, of trying to discover who God is. And he goes to God's presence and he waits. And it makes me realize even more that God hurts when we hurt. Because if Habakkuk waited and God didn't show up, that would be hard for us to grasp. Well, God just doesn't care then. When his people seek him, God meets them. Because when we experience pain, God experiences that pain with us. We won't always have all the answers. And Habakkuk admitted that God's people were making terrible decisions under the reign of King Jehoiakim. He recognized that. He affirmed that. He didn't try to hide that. But yet, why didn't God send a revival? That's what Habakkuk wanted God to do. When Habakkuk came to God first, he listed all these injustices of God's people, and he wanted God to send a revival, but God said, I'm going to send destruction. And that was hard. We hurt. We have difficulties in our lives. The date of November 8th, 2004 is a day I will always remember. One of my best friends in high school, his name is Johnny. He's a year younger than me. Johnny is the youngest of 5. He has 4 older siblings who are all significantly older than him. So by the time we got to high school, they were all out of the house, married, had kids. So this was a Monday. November 8th was a Monday. Johnny's dad was out of town on work, which wasn't normal, but he happened to be out of town. Monday morning, my parents come into my room and wake me up. This was highly unusual because I set my alarm. I didn't have a problem getting up for school. And so my parents come in and wake me up, and they say, Diane died. And I just woke up, and I wasn't fully cognizant. And I said, what? So Johnny's mom died. So I get dressed, brush my teeth, and I go over there. And I remember walking into the back of his house, and there were a few people already there, and I just gave Johnny a hug. And we cried for several moments. I don't remember how long, but I remember we just sat there and we cried. Johnny was 16 at the time. His mom had a brain aneurysm and didn't wake up. Johnny was home alone. 16-year-old walks down the stairs in the morning, getting ready for school, to find his mother had not woken up and he's alone. There was nothing I could say in that moment that would make anything better. But that hug, that presence, those tears are the only thing that I could do in that time to be there. And as I think about that story, as I think about the hurt that Johnny experienced, I think God is just waiting there with his arms wide open and saying, come to me. I want to be here with you. And so today's not about having the answers. It's about sitting in God's presence. It's about waiting. Because I don't have all the answers for your specific situation. But I know that if we seek God and sit in his presence, we're going to gain divine wisdom that we otherwise would not have. That doesn't mean the situation is going to change. That doesn't mean it's going to be all better. But it's about coming to God's presence.